Consciousness is a property of space that has physical effects. And you might be wondering, hey, that's the same definition you gave for a quantum field. Yes, it is. Because I want to say, I've actually been kind of lying to you guys a little bit because I've been saying I wanted to model consciousness on a field view. But the truth is, I actually want to say consciousness is a field. It is a field. Consciousness is intrinsic to the ground or nature of reality, as fields are, or anything else that we find in reality. And I think it's obvious when you start thinking about consciousness in that way. So instead of just saying consciousness is awareness or knowing or luminosity and all these sort of vague terms, we can instead say that consciousness is a property of space itself that has physical effects, the property of which is knowing it. So almost all consciousness or conscious experience is modulated by spatiality and temporality. So you can see this when you look at that definition of like consciousness being a property of space. It's knowing space. That's the property. It's awareness of space. And if you think about all of the ways in which you know the world epistemologically as a conscious witnessing subject to the universal movement, then you realize that it's everything, all sensation is spatial feeling. So when you're hungry, you feel it in your stomach, but that's a spatial kind of feeling. And the same thing with taste and sound, and the whole visual field is itself a field that is external to you. If we model or say that consciousness is a field, we can honor William James's quote at the beginning there by saying that it's just intrinsic to the nature of reality, and consciousness is a field. The unique thing about being a biological creature is not that we produce consciousness, but that we actually access a field that is already there. But we access it in a myriad of different ways based on the complexity of our organism. So in this way, you can think of the field of consciousness as permeating the entire universe, although not everything is conscious. So just like when you have an electron field, the psi field that permeates the entire universe, and it's way out in the middle of the electromagnetic field, or it's way out in between galaxies and everything, this electron field is there. However, if there's no electrons present in the field out there, then it has like a very, very tiny value. Even though no electrons are present in the electron field out in the middle, in between galaxies and stuff, there's still an electron field. It's just not being accessed or activated by the sort of objects that are said to propagate through that field. In this way, we can think of consciousness, if we change our way in which we think of what consciousness is, and say that consciousness is the ground of reality itself and is a field that is accessed to varying different degrees depending on the complexity of the biological organism that is co-producing and accessing the field, then we can actually start to see that consciousness is a thing. It's a somewhat. Even though it's still an immaterial entity, but it's a thing in the same sense that the magnetic field is a thing. It's a no thing that's a something. But it's a special kind of no thing because it's obviously not nothing. And to go back to honor James, I made a video saying on the transcendental and existential primacy of consciousness, because human beings live consciousness in the first person, and you cannot get behind it. You can't get underneath it, you can't get behind it. It seems to be absolutely rock bottom, and it's irreducible. So consciousness shares the descriptive words that we use with fields, that is immateriality and irreducibility. It's just rock bottom. We don't know why that's the case, but that's the case. When you think of an electron having a negative electrical charge, and that property of the electron is what makes it gravitate towards a proton, we don't know why an electron has charge, but we observe that that's the case, and we observe the dynamic relationship between the proton and the electron, and we can tell, and we name this thing electrical charge, and that's just the fundamental property that we say it has. So when we talk about a field as being a property or condition of space, it's just a rock bottom property, and that's the case. We don't know why that's the case, just like we don't know why electrons have negative charge, but they do. That's just the way it is. This way, if we say that consciousness is a field and it permeates the entire universe, then it just depends on what sort of complex energetic relationships get together that become complex enough in some strange sense that it now begins to access the field. Because in this view of consciousness being a field, I want to say that the single cell is kind of like the quanta of the mind field, if we want to call it that. But a single cell is a single sort of discrete quanta of the mind field, and it has become. And here's like, I'm not saying there's a lot of mysteries still left. There's a bazillion mysteries about existence still left, but I think we can model consciousness on this field view, and I think it's profitable because if we look at single cells as the quanta of the mind field, but they are an incredibly complex sort of system of organization of energy, and it's by their functioning that they start resonating in the mind field. And the more and more complexity you get, the more and more consciousness you get. I think it's safe to say that singular cells are primitively sentient. That is, they're not conscious in the way we think about human beings conscious, but primitive sentience. Like, they show signs of behavior by performing bacterial chemotaxis and crossing the petri dish looking for food, but they don't know they know. It's a very primitive sort of sentience and just a flickering of consciousness, I think. It's like the consciousness of your baby toe, maybe. But I think we can look at single cells as the quanta of the mind field. And then as you grow in complexity, then you start to gain greater consciousness. You expand your consciousness, if you will, if you like that term. And you start to know the world, which is the universe, which consciousness is, which the world also is. You start to know the world in novel ways, but always as a space. Because I imagine when I feel my pinky toe or I stub my pinky toe, it's pain, but pain is a spatial feeling. And I didn't even mention in defining consciousness with the exact same definition of a physical field, that is a property of space that has physical effects. The property of space is, of course, awareness of or knowing space in a multiplicity of different ways because human beings are extremely complex. And as I said, neuroscientists have discovered 30 odd senses, including proprioception and kinetic sense and just hunger and needing to go to the bathroom. A lot of senses, a lot of phenomenological feeling. All of these have to do with spatial awareness in a certain sense. And then temporality is brought in by the fact it has physical effects. So when we bring in temporality and time and say that consciousness has physical effects, I think it's pretty obvious what those physical effects are. Because whatever we think about, we bring about. And I don't mean to say that consciousness is only thought-bound or thought-based, but whatever we think about, we bring about. So the camera I'm staring into right now is a product of consciousness. Human beings had to invent this. So all great inventions are distillations of human thought in a certain very poetic and beautiful sense. But that's true. Even the building I'm standing in, my house, existed in the minds of people before it was a physical object in the world. So consciousness as a property of space that has physical effects, I think is a better definition, a better working, descriptive, explanatory definition of what consciousness is, rather than just saying consciousness is this immaterial knowing that, and that's it. That's a difficult way to look at it, or it's a very vague way to look at it. And to return to the primacy of consciousness, we already know that with regards to human experience, it is both transcendentally and existentially primary. That is, we can't get underneath it. But there's debate as to whether it's ontologically primary. That is, did consciousness exist before human beings were around, or life? And if we look at a linear evolution of the universe, it's kind of hard to honor William James's quote at the beginning and just introduce consciousness arbitrarily somewhere along the line, maybe 10 billion years into the evolution of the universe, and all of a sudden consciousness shows up. But if we think of consciousness as already a field that was already ubiquitous and present in the universe, and it's just the way in which energy had to evolve and build upon itself using different platforms of complexity until it could emerge consciousness. Or rather, The complexification of energy is what led to this mind field being accessed, or accessed and produced at the same time. So that's what I think consciousness is. I think consciousness is the space itself. And finally, one last thing from transcendental ontology. Transcendental ontology adds to the fact of existence that the thoughts about the way the world is are in fact a way the world is. So even right or wrong, the way I think, and if I'm thinking badly or well, or my beliefs are erroneous or whatever, those beliefs, those thoughts, my consciousness is a way in which the world is. So you can't. So mind and world in modern philosophy they've already merged. There's no more subject-object dichotomy in a sort of sense, because mind and world no longer become separate entities, but part of one and the same movement in sort of a Schopenhauer type will type way. That's what consciousness is. Consciousness is obviously part of the universe. It's obviously irreducible and intrinsic, rock bottom. You can't get around it. So, and I didn't even mention the Upanishads have been saying this for the last 3,000 years, and anybody with even the slightest hint of mystical bent, which mysticism, by the way, is a great thing. A lot of people harp on mysticism because they equate it with New Age, especially in the scientific community, and they equate it with belief in the power of crystals and all this stuff. But mysticism actually is just about honoring different functions or states of consciousness that also have noetic value. So, in altered states of consciousness, there's different ways. If just by being in an altered state of consciousness, you learn something about the world. It has epistemological and noetic value. So you can't. So to demonize mysticism all the time, I think, is redundant and silly. And any scientist who demonizes mysticism or fluffs it off as if it's nothing has totally missed the point of what mysticism is trying to get at. And basically, mysticism, I just want to say, mysticism is honoring total consciousness. So if there's a new and rare and novel state or function in consciousness that not everybody knows about, but other people have experienced, we need to honor that. So mysticism obviously can tell us something about the universe. And not only that, mysticism can tell us that consciousness is the ground of reality. There's a state of consciousness, or a rare state of consciousness, or function in consciousness, whatever you want to call it, called introception. It's basically the enlightenment experience. It's when the unification of mind and world happens. And it's a real state of consciousness. And it obviously has knowledge value because it tells you you're one with the universe. Whatever that means. So that's it. I think consciousness is a property of space that has physical effects. The property is knowing it. The effect is obviously, I don't know, the painting over there, or the light bulb, or the couch. Somebody had to make that. All this stuff. It's just coming out of human beings. It's coming out of consciousness, which we are, and the world is. Anyways, thanks for watching.